They found the boy sitting at the edge of a clearing near Elkmont, in the Tennessee stretch of the Great Smoky Mountains, in the autumn of 1902. He had not eaten in days. His shoes were gone. His small hands were stained with a pale grey dust that would not wash off no matter how they scrubbed, and when the two timber cruisers who found him tried to speak, he said nothing at all. For almost a full day he stayed silent. Then, near the fire that first night, he finally spoke. He did not ask about his mother, or his father, or his sisters. He asked the two men whether the others had climbed out of the pit yet. He said there were still more people down there. He said they were counting the floors. If you want to follow stories like this one, the accounts that never reached any school book, the records that were quietly filed away and left to rot in county basements, then subscribe now and stay close to this channel. What this boy described in those mountains that autumn is something the official survey of the region was later rewritten to avoid. Subscribe and let us walk into it together, one careful step at a time. To understand what happened, you have to understand where it happened. In 1902, the Smokies were not the tidy national park that millions of families visit today. That protection would not arrive for another 3 decades. Back then, the high coves and hollows were a tangle of old-growth timber, granite outcrops, and settlements so remote that a family could go a whole winter without seeing another living soul. The people who lived there were mountain families, most of them descended from settlers who had pushed into the range generations earlier. They farmed thin soil, they hunted, and they kept to themselves. Outsiders were rare, and the ones who came were usually after the timber, and even the timbermen, hard and practical as they were, kept their own private map of the range, a map of the coves you worked and the ones you left alone. There were hollows in those mountains that no crew would cut, not out of any written rule, but out of a shared and unspoken sense that some ground was better left standing. The high hollow above the little river was one of them. The boy's family had a name the records give as Harmon, though even that is uncertain, because the pages where it should appear are among the ones that went missing. What the surviving accounts agree on is that the family had settled a high hollow above the little river, in a spot that older residents avoided. The reason those older residents gave was simple. They said the ground up there was wrong. They said that in certain places, if you stamped your boot down hard, the earth answered back with a hollow sound, as though something large and empty lay just beneath the surface. Some of them called it the drum ground. Most of them simply refused to go anywhere near it. There were older stories too, the kind that got told in low voices when the children were supposed to be asleep. Stories of a hunting party that had camped in that hollow 2 generations back and come down, changed men, unable to say what they had seen. Stories of Dot that would walk right up to the edge of the drum ground, plant their feet, and refuse to take another step, no matter how they were called. None of it was ever written down anywhere. It lived only in the memory of the oldest families, passed along as a warning, and by the time the Harmons arrived, most people had stopped believing in it enough to say it out loud. The Harmon family did not have that luxury. They were poor, the good land was already taken, and the high hollow was free for anyone willing to work it. So they raised their cabin, they cleared what they could, and for a season or 2 they lived up there without any trouble at all. There were 7 of them, a mother, a father, 4 children, and an elderly grandfather who rarely spoke a word. The boy who was found near Elkmont was the second youngest of the 4. When the timber cruisers found him wandering, he was the only one of those 7 that anyone would ever see again. The alarm was raised almost by accident. A pair of surveyors working for a timber concern had been mapping the ridges that autumn, marking stands of chestnut and poplar for a rail line that was being pushed slowly up the valley. Their route took them near the Harmon Hollow, and when they passed the cabin they found the door standing wide open, the fire long gone cold, and a pot of food gone to mould on the table. Nothing had been taken. The father's rifle still hung on its pegs by the door. The children's few belongings were still folded neatly in their places. It looked, one of the surveyors later wrote in a report that no longer exists in full, as though the whole family had stood up in the middle of an ordinary evening and walked out into the dark, all at once, and simply never come back. A lamp had been left burning until its oil ran dry. A child's small carved toy lay on the floor by the hearth where it had been dropped. Every sign pointed to a household interrupted in the middle of a single quiet moment, and yet there was no sign of a struggle anywhere. No blood, no broken thing, no track leading away that any of them could follow into the trees. The surveyors did what anyone would do. They searched the ground around the cabin, they called out, and they found nothing. Then they went down the mountain and reported it. Within a few days, a search party of local men had formed. They knew that country, or they thought they did, and they fanned out through the hollow, fully expecting to find bodies. A fall from a ledge, a drowning, a bear, some ordinary mountain tragedy with an ordinary explanation waiting at the end of it. What they found instead was the beginning of something not one of them could explain. Near the back of the Harmon clearing, in a stand of old hemlocks the family had left uncut, the searchers found an opening in the ground. It was not a cave mouth of the kind the region was full of. Those are ragged and natural, shaped by water over ages. This was something else entirely. The men who described it said the edges were too straight. They said the opening was roughly square, wider than a wagon, and that the sides went down not as rough stone but as fitted blocks, course upon course of them, dressed and squared, and set together so tightly that a knife blade would not slide between them. It looked, they said, like the top of something built, something that had been standing there long before the Harmons ever arrived, and long before anyone in those mountains could remember. One of the searchers, a man who had spent 40 years in those woods and had seen every kind of sinkhole and cave the range could produce, said later that the sight of it turned his stomach in a way he could not put into words. It was the wrongness of it, he said. Nature does not build in straight lines and true corners. Whatever had shaped that opening had a plan, and had followed that plan with a patience that felt older than the trees standing over it. It was two of those searchers, working a wider ring away from the pit, who finally found the boy. He was more than a mile from the clearing, sitting at the edge of the open ground near Elkmont, as though he had walked there in a straight line through country that had no straight lines anywhere in it. He was filthy, half-starved, and covered in that same pale grey dust. He did not run from them. He did not cry. He simply looked up at them with the flat, worn expression of someone who has already seen the very thing you are afraid of, and he let them carry him down. For most of a day he would not speak, and the men around the fire did not push him. Mountain people understood shock. They fed him a little at a time, they kept him warm, and they waited. It was only when the dark came down fully, and the fire was the only light for miles in any direction, that the boy started to talk, and what he said did not match anything at all that the searchers had prepared themselves to hear. Before we move on to what the boy described in the pit, stop for a second. What you just heard about the family walking out into the dark all at once is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the full account. The square opening, the counted floors, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. He told them that the family had not wandered off. He said they had been called. He said that for weeks before that final night, his grandfather had been going out to the square opening and sitting beside it in the dark, listening because the old man swore he could hear people down there. At first, the whole family thought the grandfather was losing his mind. Then, the boy said, they started to hear it too, a sound coming up out of the fitted stone. Not wind, not water. Voices, faint and even, and underneath the voices, a steady counting, on and on, numbers spoken aloud, in an order that never once stopped. The boy said that on the last night his father took a lantern and a rope and lowered himself into the pit to see for himself. He said his father called back up that it was not a well and it was not a cave. He said it went down in levels. Floors, the boy called them, one below another, each one ringed with that same fitted stone, each one open in the middle so a man could look straight down through it like looking down a stairwell that had no stairs. And on each floor, the boy said, there were people, standing at the edges, facing inward, counting. He said his father never came back up. He said the rope went slack, and then the voice that called up the next time was his father's voice, but the words were wrong, flat and even like all the others, and it was counting. One by one, the boy said, the rest of the family climbed down to bring him back, his mother, his sisters. The grandfather went last of all, and the grandfather went gladly, and each one of them, once they reached the bottom, took a place at the edge and turned inward and began to count. The boy said he stood at the lip of the pit holding the lantern and watched his whole family become part of the ring below him, their faces lit from beneath, all of them saying numbers, and not one of them ever saying his name. He said the strangest part, the part he kept circling back to, was how peaceful they all looked. There was no fear in any of their faces. His mother, who had been frightened of the dark her whole life, stood at the edge of that pit and counted into it as calmly as if she were reciting a prayer she had known since childhood. It was as though the moment they touched the bottom, whatever it was that made them themselves had been gently set down and folded away, and something far older had taken up their voices in its place. He did not go down. He said something inside him would not let his feet move to that first block of stone, so he ran. He ran off into the dark, and he kept running, he said, for what felt like days, until the two men found him at Elkmont. And the thing he could not stop asking, the thing he asked over and over that night by the fire, was whether the others had finished counting yet. Because he was certain, in the calm and terrible way that only a child in deep shock can be certain, that when the counting reached its end, something down there was going to come up. Now, there are people who will tell you this is only a story. A frightened child, a family lost to some ordinary disaster, a tale that grew in the retelling until it became the thing we have in front of us now. And that is a fair position to take. It is the reasonable one. But it does not sit easily beside the physical thing the searchers described, because those searchers were grown men, sober and unimpressed by ghost stories, and every one of them agreed on the same impossible detail. The opening in the hemlocks was made of dressed and fitted stone, and it went down further than any of them dared to follow. A few of the bolder men did go down, at least part way. They lowered a lantern on a rope and climbed after it, and what they reported matched the boy almost exactly. Levels. Each one ringed in that same tight masonry, each one opening onto the next through a shaft cut clean in the centre. They described walls that were not carved out of the native rock of the Smokies at all, but built, block by patient block, by hands that plainly knew exactly what they were doing, and they described the same pale grey dust coating every surface, the same dust that would not wash from the boy's stained hands. The deepest any of them went, by the accounts that survived, was 4 levels down. The man who reached that 4th floor said the air changed there. It grew still and heavy and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season up above, and the counting, which had been faint at the surface, was much clearer down there, though he could never once find a mouth that was making it. He said the sound seemed to come from the stone itself, from every direction and from no direction, and that when he finally realized he could no longer tell which way was up toward the world and which way was down toward whatever lay below the 4th floor, he climbed out and swore he would never go back in. None of them ever did. This is the point where the ordinary explanations begin to strain. The Smokies are ancient mountains, some of the oldest on Earth, and their geology has been studied for over a century. There is no record, in any official survey, of a fitted stone structure descending in ringed levels beneath that ground. And yet, in this reading, that is exactly what those men climb down into. Researchers who study the buried and forgotten architecture of North America, the people who argue that our accepted timeline has enormous gaps cut into it, point to accounts like this one as evidence of something they believe the record has quietly erased. They argue that structures like the one in the Harmon Hollow were raised by a civilization that predates the settlement of those mountains by a span of time we cannot easily imagine, and that at some point, through flood or upheaval or something stranger still, that entire world was buried and its story carefully removed from the books. They point to the fitted, mortarless stonework as their strongest piece of evidence, because that particular style of building, enormous blocks shaped and set without any binding between them, appears again and again at sites scattered all across the world that mainstream history insists have no connection to one another. In this reading, the Harmon Hollow was not a grave and not a mine. It was one more surviving fragment of that lost network, an access point into a structure whose true depth and purpose were never meant to be found by the people who came after. And the grey dust, they argue, was not ordinary dust at all, but the fine residue of whatever catastrophe had buried that world in the first place, still clinging to its walls after centuries in the dark. In that framing, the counting takes on a very different weight. It stops being madness and starts becoming memory. A ring of people on each descending floor reciting numbers without any end, would look to the ones who hold this view like the last automatic echo of whatever those levels were originally built to do. Not a haunting at all, but a machine of stone and voice still running long after the hands that built it were gone, still patiently waiting for its count to finally be complete. It is an unsettling idea, and it asks us to accept a great deal on very little hard proof. But the ones who hold to it will remind you that the proof was there, in fitted stone, seen and touched and climbed by sober men, right up until the moment someone decided it should be sealed over and struck from the record. Absence of evidence, they say, is a very strange thing to find sitting in the spot where the evidence used to be. Whatever the truth of it is, what happened next is the part that should trouble even the hardened skeptics. Within a year, the survey being run for that rail line was quietly redrawn. The route that would have carried the line straight past the Harmon Hollow was moved, at real and unwelcome expense, onto a longer and much harder grade. The reason given in the paperwork was unstable ground. No mention at all was made of what had been found up there, and the pages of that survey, which would have described the hollow itself, the fitted opening, the levels below it, are among the documents that are simply not in the file anymore. The record has a hole in it, in the exact shape of the thing the boy described. The opening itself was sealed. The men who did it filled the top of the shaft with rubble and heavy timber and covered the whole of it over, and within a single generation the hemlocks and the laurel had swallowed the spot completely. When the national park was finally established in the 1930s, that stretch of the high country was mapped, photographed and catalogued as carefully as all the rest of it, and no square stone pit appears anywhere in those records. Either it was never truly there, or it is one of the many things the mountains have always chosen to keep to themselves. As for the boy, the accounts thin out and then stop altogether. Some say a family down in the valley took him in, and that he grew up quiet and withdrawn, never returning to the high hollows for the rest of his life. Others say he never fully came back from that single night, that he would sit still for hours with his head cocked to one side as if listening, and that near the very end of his life he told a doctor he could still hear the counting, faint and even, always just a little closer to the end than it had been the day before. What that doctor made of it we do not know. His notes, if he ever kept any, have not survived. Like so much else in this account, the one man who might have explained it has become just another name that leads nowhere, another thread that pulls taut for a moment and then simply falls slack in the hand. We will most likely never know what the Harmon family walked into that autumn. The proof, if there ever was any proof, lies under rubble and root and a century of silence, in a fold of mountains that were old before the pyramids were raised and that have never been in any hurry to explain themselves. But the shape of the story is a hard one to shake off. A structure that should not exist, built by hands the history books do not account for, a whole family drawn down into it one by one, and a single small child who would not take that last step, left standing alone at the edge of a buried world with a question that not one of us can answer. If this is the kind of history that keeps you awake at night, the buried and the rewritten and the deliberately forgotten, then you are already in exactly the right place. Stay close to this channel. There are more of these coming, and each one takes us a little deeper into the version of the past that someone once went to a great deal of trouble to bury. Watch the next one on your screen right now, and keep